Hi, class. Welcome to week 3. I hope everyone is doing well and staying healthy and is able to cope on these very long days of staying in the house. So, we are moving right along to chapter 9, which is all about relationships. Now, we actually break out chapter 9. It's a very long chapter, but we actually break it out into several different pieces because there are so many parts about relationships that actually come together when we think about everything that we've learned over the past several weeks, all about starting with self-communication and then one-on-one communication, and then ways in which we choose our words and how powerful they are, our perception and how we gauge what is reality and what is important to us, and then verbal communication, the choices of the words that we use, nonverbal communication, sometimes more accurate communication, which is all of the ways in which we communicate without using our words. So all of those things come together into forming interpersonal relationships. So these are all of the relationships that you have with people in your life. And remember, relationships are defined several different ways. We have friends, we have significant others, we have parents, we have family, we have close friends, we have acquaintances, we have work relationships where you're close friends, where your work relationships are acquaintances. You have family dynamics, you have workplace dynamics, you have friend group dynamics. All of these relationships that you have in your life, all these interpersonal relationships you have in your life, all have their own different leveling of ways in which we establish the relationship, the ways in which we maintain the relationship, and then sometimes previous relationships that we've had, ways in which we've dissolved these relationships. So part 1, we are going to talk about relationships. So we're just going to kind of do surface level stuff to introduce the idea of interpersonal relationships, and then we are going to build upon over the next couple of weeks, moving that out to the different types of relationships. So let's start with some definitions for you. Relationship. So book defines relationship as the connection established between one person and how they communicate with another. So that's a relationship, right? That's the 360 overall kind of generic in a way definition of a relationship. Now, our class, all about interpersonal relationships, goes a little deeper and says that interpersonal relationships have a perception that is shared. And I capitalize that because that is the key in interpersonal relationships, is that there's a shared perception by two people of an ongoing interdependent connection of relational expectations and varied intimacy. And remember, as we've talked about throughout the semester, a couple important things about that definition. One, perception is individual, right? But there has to be a level of shared perception when it comes to interpersonal relationships. So yes, your perception is still your own unique perception based on your lived experiences, but in interpersonal relationships, there's a level of it being shared by two people. There's an ongoing interdependent connection, and you have relational expectations and intimacy. And remember, intimacy isn't feelings of sex or sexual attraction. Intimacy in interpersonal relationships is the term we use to talk about how deep you know somebody, how intimate you have decided to become with somebody. Basically, how deep your level of self-disclosure is, because the more you self-disclose to someone, the more they know about you, the more intimate your relationship becomes. So key things there: shared perception, ongoing interdependent connection of relational expectations, and varied intimacy. So using that definition, I want to actually break down these items and talk to you a little bit about what they mean. So we talked about right now that perception must be shared, right? And the way in which we share perception is we have certain lived experiences or a set of attitudes, values, and beliefs that we share with somebody else. We usually have the deepest connection with people that we can share experiences with. It doesn't mean we've had the same life experience. It doesn't mean we come from the same background. It doesn't mean we come from the same set of attitudes, values, and beliefs that maybe we were raised or exposed to, but it means that on some level, your perception of things are shared. Your perception of the relationship is also a shared, 100% shared perception, meaning that you both have the perception that this relationship is important and of value in your life. The second one is the idea of interdependent connection. And what that means is that to an extent, there's a dependence on each other for a certain level of trust, self-disclosure, and intimacy, meaning that to a degree you trust the person that you are spending your time with and have a relationship with. You have a level of self-disclosure, so you tell them things that are important to you, that affect you, that make you happy, that make you sad. You are trusting that you are able to have a deeper level of self-disclosure with that person. You are open with that person, right? Think about the window where you are truly open with that person. And as we just mentioned, the level of intimacy is greater because your level of self-disclosure is deeper. The third one is the relational expectations, and that is these preformed expectations that you have in a relationship based on your past experience with relationships, because all relationships we have in our lives show us and teach us our expectations we have for relationships. Everything that we have lived in relationships in our life up until this moment actually helps us set the expectations of things that we want in relationships. So think back to growing up, middle school, high school, the relationships that we had that we can go back and think about that weren't good for us, right? That just weren't fair, were sometimes deceitful, just didn't add value to our life, and that in fact might have taken away from the value of your life. We learned lessons from those relationships, right? You learned what you have tolerance for. You've learned what levels of respect you are expecting from people and you will give back as the other person in that relationship. You learn how to trust somebody. You learn behaviors that are untrustworthy. So past experience all influences these expectations we have of relationships. As we grow up and as we mature and as we develop stronger interpersonal relationships, these expectations from our lived experiences and life lessons from these previous past experience relationships help form our relational expectations. Also, part 2 of relational expectations, past experience being the first one, the second one is the relationship level. So if you know somebody on a very deep level, let's say a significant other of yours, your relational expectations of them are going to be most likely probably deeper, and you're going to have higher expectations than you would if, let's say, you had a very introductory friendship with a neighbor down the street. Right? Your relational expectations from them are going to be much different than they would be from the person that you would consider to be your significant other. So our expectations are set by those previous past experiences that influence our experiences and what we're willing to tolerate, and the level of the relationship that we have. Okay, so relationship level, a quick example would be the relationship you have with your best friend versus maybe the relationship you have with your in-laws, right? Some of you might have the same exact relationship. Some of you might not. Your expectations of what you expect from your best friend probably are a lot different than the expectations you have from your in-laws, right? So there's a good example for you. And then the last one is intimacy. And intimacy are levels that are mutually confirmed. That means that in intimacy, you have this expectation of yourself to be open, honest, and give a level of self-disclosure. You have an acceptance of yourself for who you really are. And then you kind of vote for yourself, right? You have this idea that you are in an important part in the relationship that you have. And why that's important is if you think about self-communication, self-worth, self-value, all that stuff we talked about at the very beginning of the semester, that comes back up in your important role that you have in this interpersonal relationship. You have to be confident in yourself and have good self-worth if you feel like you're able to have a strong sense of self to get intimate with somebody, to have deeper levels of self-disclosure with somebody. That is all interdependent and related. So let's talk about the next part, which is relationships that we have in our lives that are because of the circumstances that we find ourselves in, and then the relationships that we actually choose in our life. Remember, you have probably heard in the past things like you can choose who your friends are, but you can't choose who your family is, right? That's absolutely true when we talk about interpersonal relationships. There are relationships that we have in our lives. They are there because of the circumstances we find ourselves in. That means things like the family that you were born into. That circumstance can't change. I mean, you can choose not to have a relationship with somebody in your family, but the fact that they are your parents, your brother or sister, your aunt, your uncle, your second cousin on your mom's side, whatever, that doesn't change. They are still that person in your life. It's just the level of interpersonal relationship you want to have with them may vary, right? So relationships of choice are all the relationships that we choose to put our energy into. We choose to have a connection with them, a relational expectation of them. We choose to self-disclose and get intimate with somebody so they know us better. Those are all the things that we choose. So let's talk about some examples of these things. Circumstance relationships, family by birth, the teachers you have, right? You probably didn't choose me as your teacher. I was the one that was signed up for the Tuesday night class, signed up to teach this class. So teachers sometimes are just the circumstance you find yourself in. Same with your classmates. Think about everybody else that has sat together on Tuesday nights, up until a couple weeks ago, that we all sat together, right? You didn't get to choose those classmates. That was the circumstance you found yourself in when you signed up for this class. Your coworkers, you don't get to choose that, right? They are your coworkers that are there when you either took the job or were hired after you took the job. They are your coworkers. Sometimes that does not change. Your neighbors, who you live next to, that circumstance of where you live absolutely determines who's going to be around you and what relationships you have with them. You also have a roommate circumstance. So you can have a situation where you don't get to choose your roommate. You're kind of given your roommate. I think about my freshman roommate in college. She was horrible. And I'm being kind by saying that. It was an absolute nightmare. I ended up transferring away and going to a different school because of that situation. Learned a lot from that situation. I learned how to deal with people and how to deal with conflict and a lot about myself and what I was willing to tolerate when it came to living with somebody. But that was a interpersonal relationship of circumstance. I didn't get to choose my roommate my freshman year of college. That was just assigned to me by the random assignments that Residence Life made. I didn't get to choose that. So that was a relationship of circumstance. And I learned how to have a relationship that I didn't choose. And that's the important part about these differences of circumstance and choice, is that the dynamics of relationships that you find yourself in with no choice, like your relationships of circumstance, versus the relationships of choice where you are actually choosing. You have the freedom to choose to be in that relationship. The dynamics are so much different. So let's talk about relationships of choice. You've got your friends, you choose your friends. Your romantic relationships, you choose them. Your husband or wife, you choose that person. Your counselor, somebody you go to for advice, a therapist, right? You get to choose them. Sometimes they're assigned to you and you kind of figure out whether they are working for you or not working for you. And then you get to make a choice. You get to continue on with that person or you get to go to somebody new. A doctor, right? You get to choose that. And a roommate. Now, I know your question is, well, she just talked about how roommates are a roommate of circumstance or a relationship of circumstance. Actually, that's an important part of this, which is that these can actually flip-flop back and forth. You can have relationships that you could be in a circumstance with, like a coworker, that you end up becoming really good friends with. That becomes a relationship of choice. You could live next to somebody that you first have a relationship of being neighbors. You share property lines. There are expectations that come with that. And then you become really good friends with them. Maybe you get in a romantic relationship with them. Your roommate, you could have a roommate that you didn't choose, but you end up choosing in a further relationship to stay in that relationship with them as your roommate. You get to choose that stuff.